Benjamin Netanyahu says no ceasefire in Gaza unless Hamas releases all hostages. Before we dive in details, please subscribe to the channel and stay always one step ahead to know all global important events happening around you. Give a thumbs up and share the video with your family and friends. Let's move on with the video. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Sunday declared that Israel will not agree to a ceasefire until the Hamas terror group releases the hostages it is holding, the Times of Israel reported. Take this word ceasefire out of the lexicon. We will continue until we defeat them. We do not have an alternative, Netanyahu is quoted saying in a statement from his office. In his interactions with Air Force personnel, Prime Minister Netanyahu alluded to the opposition within his government's ranks regarding the now-paused judicial overhaul. Earlier this year, this reform had drawn protests from some reservists who announced they would stop reporting for volunteer reserve duty. Netanyahu expressed his determination, saying, "Our enemies mistook us. They thought that on a crucial day, soldiers would not show up. We showed up together, and now we are fighting shoulder to shoulder," according to the Times of Israel. Meanwhile, in a briefing to international media outlets, IDF spokesman Rear ADM Daniel Hagari presented new intelligence information and evidence demonstrating Hamas's use of medical facilities in the Gaza Strip for terror purposes. Hagari revealed a video showing an underground entrance from Sheikh Hamad Hospital, connecting to Hamas tunnel networks. Another video depicted Hamas gunmen opening fire at Israeli forces from within the hospital. Hagari further disclosed the IDF's intelligence about a tunnel network under the so-called Indonesian hospital, along with aerial imagery showing rocket launchers located near the complex. "If it weren't enough that we exposed a tunnel under the hospital, the terrorists also shot at our soldiers from within the hospital," he said. He added, Hamas systematically built the Indonesian hospital to disguise its underground terror infrastructure and presented recordings of calls between Hamas officials discussing their use of fuel reserves belonging to the Indonesian hospital. Separately, Hagari highlighted the IDF's efforts to warn Palestinians in northern Gaza to evacuate to the south. Over 20,000 phone calls and more than 1.5 million flyers were distributed in northern Gaza. He emphasized, "Our war is with Hamas, not the civilians in Gaza. We will not accept Hamas's cynical use of hospitals to hide their terror infrastructure. Hamas's exploitation of hospitals must come to an end. The situation in Gaza remains volatile, with Israel pressing for the release of hostages and steadfastly rejecting calls for an immediate ceasefire. Israel's heavy bombardment of Gaza has intensified, particularly in the north, where many civilians remain trapped and unable to flee. Israeli attacks on 3 refugee camps in the last 24 hours have killed more than 50 people. At least 9,770 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli attacks on Gaza since October 7th. More than 1,400 people were killed in Israel," Al Jazeera reported. The US, a key player on the Security Council, has received criticism for its support for Israel, asserting that a public pronouncement would not necessarily help de-escalate the situation. This is not to say that all nations are in agreement. France, for instance, proposed a resolution for a ceasefire, a move that received support from China. Yet, even with this backing, the resolution has not yet been passed, illustrating the complexities and challenges inherent in international diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Biden administration, back home in the United States, is facing its own pressures. There are calls for the administration to take a harder line against Israel. Yet President Biden has voiced support for a ceasefire, while simultaneously defending Israel's right to self-defense. This delicate balancing act illustrates the intricate and often precarious nature of international relations. In the midst of this, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has announced his intention to travel to Israel and Jordan to discuss the ongoing conflict. This move is seen as a further attempt by the US to express its support for Israel's right to defend itself, while also stressing the need to minimize civilian casualties. Yet, despite these efforts, the conflict continues. Israel remains firm in its stance, rejecting calls for a ceasefire. This, coupled with the devastating effect of Israel's attacks on the Palestinian population in Gaza, has been met with condemnation from rights groups, international organizations, and neighboring countries. Despite the world's best efforts, peace remains elusive and the conflict continues to rage on. What happens when diplomacy takes the front seat, but the wheels of war continue to turn? We find ourselves asking this question as we observe the recent developments in the Israel-Gaza conflict. On one hand, we have U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken preparing to visit Israel and Jordan with a mission to discuss the ongoing conflict. His primary goal? To express U.S. support for Israel's right to defend itself, while also addressing the urgent need to minimize civilian casualties. This diplomatic move, however, has not been without its share of criticism. The United States finds itself in a delicate position, balancing its long-standing alliance with Israel against the rising tide of international and domestic calls for peace and adherence to international law. It's a tightrope walk where every word spoken and every action taken is under the world's microscope. Now let's shift our gaze to Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made a pivotal announcement. He has stated that the attacks will continue until calm is restored. But what does this calm entail? Netanyahu has made it clear that a ceasefire will not be on the cards unless Hamas releases all hostages. This firm stance has sent ripples across the globe, stirring a pot already brimming with tension and uncertainty. The refusal to cease fire until specific conditions are met, while understandable from a certain perspective, also raises questions about the potential for escalation and the impact on innocent lives caught in the crossfire. In the grand chessboard of international relations, each move carries weight. Each decision echoes through the annals of history. The stance of the United States, the firm decision of Israel, the cries for peace from the international community, and the pleas for justice from those directly affected. All of these elements are intertwined in a complex dance of diplomacy and power. As the world watches, one truth remains clear. The resolution of this conflict is as complex as its origins.